All right, welcome to 73 Mentors. Here we are today on Plato's Republic, the Capstone. We've now spent 10 weeks hitting each book in Plato's Republic, books 1 through 10. And now today we're going to spend a little time just going over the high points for ourselves. And I'm one of your co-hosts, Jason Vidaurri.
And I'm your other co-host, Vincent and Vidaurri.
And for those of you that have been with us for a while, you know we spent over an hour on each book. And we're not going to try to repeat that here tonight. We're going to actually go through it a little bit quicker, hopefully, and hit some of the high points. You know, I'm going to start off with a story, and to get us going here. It's a story about a guy named Jim Bangle. Now, Jim was a statistician and a product development engineer, and his company had just gone through a change, and they built this brand new complex. You know, a fancy complex with all these nice windows and these areas to sit and talk so the employees can visit with each other. And Jim was at this building for the first time for one of his meetings. And being the analytical type that he was, he could appreciate the beauty of it, but he also had this side of him that was started to analyze it and break it down and say, is this purposeful? Is this meeting the requirements for a good business? And Jim was also an avid reader. And in this meeting, he got onto a 20-page report that really intrigued him. He started reading it pretty in-depthly. And in the middle of that, he's like, well, I got to go to the bathroom. So he did what any good analyst would do. He took the report with him to the bathroom. And he's actually reading it on his way. As he's making his way to the bathroom, he's reading it, kind of avoiding people while he's still reading his memo. And he makes his way there and gets into the stall and, again, gets intrigued with his 20-page report. And after a little while, he hears some muffled women's voices, and he thinks to himself, well, they really did a poor job on the walls here. And so he put that kind of in the column of con against this new construction, and I thought that wasn't a very good job. And he continues his reading his report for a while, and then pretty soon he notices a little trash receptacle there on the wall next to him. It's kind of a small little thing. He looks at it and says, wow, that's kind of a strange. This must be part of the new building code or something. And he's like, seems like kind of a waste of money. It's such a small little trash can. I want to know what I use it for anyway. And he goes back to his report and starts reading some more. And about this time, he hears some women's voices again. This time they're not quite so muffled. And pretty soon he sees, below the door in his stall there, he sees some women's shoes walk by, and he's like, whoa. He said, these women are in the men's bathroom. About that time, his mind's starting to think and say, well, I don't know, not sure what the proper etiquette in this moment is. Should I tell them they're in the wrong bathroom? Should I just let them figure it out for themselves? And so he's sitting there, and then pretty soon he starts hearing some other women's voices as well. And again, those women's shoes walk in front of his stall again. He's like, what is going on here? All these women are in the wrong bathroom. And at this time, his brain's starting to go even thinking more deeply now. And he's like, well, maybe what happened, must be a women's conference going on, and they must have turned the men's bathroom into the women's bathroom, and that's why they're coming in here. He goes, they should have noticed the urinals when they came in, and his mind is going along like this for a while, and then it occurs to him, wait a minute, I don't remember urinals when I walked in here. And finally, he says to himself, oh God, I'm in the women's restroom. And like any good man would do in this situation, he pulled up his legs to hide his feet and his pants so no one could see him, and he stood in the little stall and waited until he could hear no more women in the bathroom. At which point he snuck out, and no one saw him, and he hurried back to his meeting and was thinking about it and saying, wow, how could I? There's so many signs along the way, and I didn't see it. And the story he started telling himself was to fit what he believed already. Anyway, that's the point of sharing the story to kind of kick off. It's pretty funny, and I can imagine if any of us would be in that situation, wouldn't be funny at the moment, but later on we'd laugh about it. But it's really to illustrate, how our minds will seem to work. We tend to have a certain belief or a certain view on how we see things, and when new stuff comes in, we don't generally receive it openly. It takes effort to receive it openly. Generally, we try to fit it into the story we already have going, like it was for Jim. I mean, there was all kinds of signs along the way, but he was kind of busy in his report, and then as he started thinking about them, he's tried to fit it in his own story before he really took the whole picture and said, wait a minute here, I'm the one in the wrong. I'm the one that has the wrong ideas here, not these other people around me. And so that's kicking us off here in the Capstone. So Vince, why don't you take us a little further on here?
Sure. Again, it's about Plato's Republic. And so we start off with the question is, why does Plato matter? We kicked that off in book 1. So why does Plato matter? There's a couple things why he matters. At the very bottom of that understanding is that he's considered one of the greatest 3 Greek philosophers, along with Socrates and Aristotle. And these 3 individuals set up the foundation for Western philosophy. As we went through the Republic, you realize that some of his same thoughts still echo today. And some of them are still relevant today. A lot of them are still relevant today. So I think at the very base, the most fundamental element is that it set up Western philosophy. And Jason's going to go through more or less his bio, or hit some highlights of his bio. There's not a lot there, but there is some important points to keep in mind.
Yeah, I guess that was one of the things that struck me as we jumped into Plato here, is how relevant he is in our time. Over 2,400 years later, still relevant, a lot of the things he's teaching. And like you said, Vincent, we don't have a lot on his bio. In fact, I probably get more, I feel like I'm closer to Plato because of reading all of his words through the Republic than some of the bio points we have. But I think there's still some important parts of this and some things I got out of that. So Plato was born around the end of the Golden Age in Greece. So this is around 428 BC, lived around about 348. There's some variability on the exact dates there. So he lived, into his 70s, so got to live a pretty full life. He was a student under Socrates in his youth, and that seemed to play a pretty powerful role in his life. It seems like, especially in witnessing Socrates' his death as well. One thing that struck me about Plato is that probably happened when he was in his late teens, maybe 20s, but you don't get a lot of his story after that. I guess I should back up a little bit. He was born from a prominent family, a political and wealthy family, and he could have probably followed down that line and been one of the politicians in Athens, but he didn't. And I guess to me it kind of struck me, I don't know if he disappeared. I guess that probably wouldn't be the right word, but he went and traveled and did different things from those 20s up until he was in his 40s. And really, all his works and the formation of the academy all happened when he was in his 40s and then on. And I thought that was pretty telling. So what did he do for those 20 years? Well, it seemed like he went out and learned and spoke to a lot of people and explored and tried to figure out things for himself. And then after he had that, life of experience, came back and started doing a lot of his great works that we're enjoying still all these years later. Another thing that I guess struck me is that he lost his father in his youth. So he didn't have a father for some of his growing up. Also part of the academy later on, as he's teaching, one of his students is Aristotle, as you mentioned, Vince. That's part of the top Greek philosophers. And, something that we're going to be able to study here in 73 Mentors, Aristotle's another one of our top 22. Mm-hmm. So we'll be hitting Aristotle down the road here a bit. So I'm looking forward to that and seeing what the differences and similarities are with Aristotle and Plato. I guess that's some of the top things I had from his bio. Did you have anything else you want to add to that?
No, I think that's good. I guess a couple things I'd also like to say about Plato is that the works that we have are in dialogue form, which means it is a dialogue. There's a discussion back and forth, just like the Republic. And so why do we pick the Republic versus any of his other dialogues? It's because it's the most celebrated of all of them. And it has a lot of his more mature thoughts, or a collection of all his thoughts, I think, are encompassed within Plato's Republic. So that's the only thing I'd add to his bio. I think that the reason we study the Republic, and the reason the Republic is most well studied, is because it's probably the most complete of all, most comprehensive element of all his works.
Okay. Yeah, no, I found it really fascinating, like I said, because so much is so relevant to what we're experiencing right now.
So we'll start here. Another idea is that why is he important? So this is a fairly well-known or prominent philosopher of the 20th century. His name is Alfred North Whitehead, and this is what he wrote about Plato. He said, quote, "The safest general characterization of the European philosophical tradition is that it consists of a series of footnotes to Plato." That's a huge compliment, in that Plato set up all the foundation for European philosophy going forward from 2,400 years ago and moving forward from the Renaissance to present day. There's still echoes, there's still footnotes of Plato pretty much on all of those. And I thought that's a huge endorsement of why to read Plato and Plato's Republic in particular. If we look more specifically at Plato's Republic, at the most granular level, I see it as this. It's addressing, is trying to understand, is trying to present the idea of injustice versus justice, is trying to present wrong versus right, is trying to present dishonesty versus truth, is trying to present principles versus ambiguities, is trying to delineate that. It's trying to delineate a life of ignorance versus a life of one versus a life that's weighs and considers things. That's at its most fundamental level. It's just this dichotomy it's trying to work through, saying even more fundamental is what is good, what's bad. That's it. That's what he's looking for, is what's a good life, what's a bad life. How do you lead a good life? How do you avoid leading a bad life? That's fundamentally what Plato deals with in Plato's Republic.
Yeah, it's good to keep that in mind as what is the central part of his message. Because you'll see a lot of commentaries outside of that. Because he does talk about other things. He talks about political systems. You can talk about equality between in the sexes if you want to talk about that, because there's some of that there. I guess maybe I'm throwing this back a little bit at you, Vince. So how do you take those other things? Do you just say, well, that's part of the story, but let's stay focused on the central part, or do you say that's too much elaboration off of what he's really trying to say?
I think it's part of the story. Let's think of an analogy here. It's like looking at a great painting and being concerned about the craftsmanship of the frame rather than the painting itself. Does the frame matter? Yeah, it matters because it accentuates the picture, the painting itself. But if you and I are all we focus on is the craftsmanship of the frame, we've missed the central part. The point of those, what I consider ancillary discussion points, is to bring you to or funnel you to the important component. Just like the frame accentuates the painting, these ancillary components accentuate the central theme of how do you lead a good life? How do you find a good life?
Yeah, that's important. I just want to make sure you flesh that out a little bit, because that's an important part. And like I say, if you see commentaries out there, you'll see it. They're all over. There's a lot of them and different ones that I've heard. Like you said, some of them seem to be focused on that. Well, it seems to be using these nails on the frame.
Yeah.
Type of
Yeah. Can you use a particular wood? It doesn't matter what kind of wood you use. You can use oak. You can use aspen. You can use whatever wood you want. Ash. It doesn't matter. But that again gets away from, you're looking at a Rembrandt and you're concerned about what frame it's put in. It does, again, you're missing the point.
Okay. And I think.
Yep, you're up in the definition.
All right, so here's a definition that Plato gives us through Socrates. As we experienced all through the Platos Republic, we get to hear the words of Socrates as Plato wrote them, because that's his main character, his main protagonist, making a lot of the arguments. And Socrates says this. He says, what destroys and corrupts coincides entirely with the bad, while what preserves and benefits coincides entirely with the good. And this is just a really concise definition of what's good and what's bad. And in some ways it's so simple, it seems obvious that those things that are corrupt and destroy are bad, where those things that preserve and benefit, and I like using this word of edify, they build up, they grow, those things are good. And so we get a lot of story with Plato and the Republic. We get many pages of dialogue, but then he also throws these little pieces in there. Very succinctly says, hey, here's good and here's Here's bad and here's good.
Right.
Yeah.
No, I think what this is book 9, I believe this comes about, or maybe book 10. And I just thought, of all the books that I've read and all the people I've encountered, the debate that goes on in trying to parse out what is good, what is bad. And Plato basically, in one sentence, says, this is good, this is bad. And I was like, as I read it, I just was struck at how succinct, but how thorough it was at the same time. Is that, okay, what is good? And he was referring to the soul at this point. So what's good for the soul is what preserves and benefits it, or as Jason mentions, edifies it in a sense. What destroys it and corrupts it is bad for it. It's that easy, I guess. Throughout the Republic, we get ideas of, I'll give you a couple contrasts. The idea of gluttony versus temperance, the idea of cowardness versus courage, ignorance versus knowledge, despair versus joy, avarice versus contentment, apathy versus love. Those are all examples, and again, what we're looking at here fundamentally is vice versus virtue. That's what it comes down to, vice versus virtue. And Jason mentioned earlier is this idea of these peripheral issues that we consider peripheral issues. And I wanted to tell a story regarding that, in that recently Jason and I were in Philadelphia, and we went to the Barnes Foundation. Now, the Barnes Foundation, Alfred Barnes was in pharmaceutics in the early 20th century, and he amassed a tremendous amount of wealth by patenting an antiseptic, I believe it was a silver antiseptic, in the early 20th century. And he came out, I believe it was being patented out of Germany, and it made a tremendous amount of wealth. And one of the factories he had was in Philadelphia. Next to his Philadelphia factory was his house, and on his house he built a gallery. And this gallery he filled up with what is today one of the greatest and most extensive collections of Impressionist, Post-Impressionist, and early modern paintings. And the collection is just phenomenal. That gallery that he built next to his house, they built a replica of it and opened it up in downtown Philadelphia in 2012. And that's what Jason and I went to. And I'll be honest, when we walked in, I wasn't expecting very much. I was like, oh, this is a private collection. How good could it really be? Because I didn't do my research, unfortunately, about what he had done, but which sometimes is pleasantly surprising. I was just overwhelmed. Jason and I walked through there. We spent several hours in there, and he had upwards of 12 rooms. And I would say within the entire gallery, he had over, what do you think, Jason? Over 70 or 80 collections of Renoirs. Oh, I mean, there's, really? Yeah, maybe even more. Yeah. And then Cezannes, he had probably over 60 or 70 Cezannes. There were some that he had one of only one. He had only one picture or one painting of a Cezanne that was in the entire world. And so, but I say that is that we were walking from room to room, and this was just it was just phenomenal how much he had and the collections he had. I've never seen a collection of Impressionistic art and Post-Impressionistic art in the way he had it, and just the breadth at which he had it. But I realized as I was walking through, I had my cell phone, and as I was going through, I was taking pictures of all these masterpieces. And I just kept taking pictures after picture after picture. And I started to realize as the day went on that I wasn't there. I was in front of the painting, but I wasn't being there. I was allowing my phone to filter out my interaction with these paintings, with these masterpieces. And I wasn't being there. And so I put my phone away and attempted to just be in front of the painting. Don't worry about taking the picture, getting the right angle, working around people to get the right pictures. Just be with the painting to see what that artist, the gift that artist had. And it's fascinating. It fascinated me in several elements when I did that. Is that here is a individual that's a human being that in many respects, biologically and otherwise, is very similar to me. And yet he has created something that I could never create. He is able to, we've talked about this in Plato's Republic, and this is my thought, is that he's able to brush up against the form of the good. He's able to brush up against one of those ideals of beauty, the ideal of beauty, and bring down just a little spark of it and put it in one of those paintings. And it's there for me to observe. It's there for me to experience if I would just be there. And as I did that, I was able to appreciate and see the beauty of their mastery of the painting that they were trying to get. And I mention that only in this regard, is that when you come to Plato's Republic, can you talk about feminism? Sure. Can you talk about communal living? Sure. Can you talk about political theory, poetry, military? You could talk about marital arrangements. You can talk about all these things. But to use the analogy, to use my story, is that in a sense what you're doing is what I was doing, is that I was putting the phone between me and the masterpiece, and it was acting as a filter. And I was focusing on my phone more than I was focusing on the actual painting. And I was missing the point. I was missing the element of beauty that was there, and I was allowing something else to get in the way of that. And the same thing here is that if you focus on those ancillary components, they get in the way, and they can detract from the beauty and the experience that Plato's Republic can offer.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, Vincent. And that I think there's also something that happens too. It's not only that it is enjoying the beauty that's there, that the artist is trying to create, but there's also, see, I'm not much of an art viewer. I'm very novice at the whole thing. But I did enjoy seeing, I mean, I could still relate and see some of that beauty and say, wow, how do they create such an image? But I found myself attracted to a couple of different paintings there, and I was kind of reflecting upon this after. There were kind of these a little bit darker ones. They had skulls in them. There's kind of this death portrait in there. And instead of just, I guess, at least in a couple moments there I had, instead of noticing the people and other things, I let that image impact me. And move me inside to some degree. And maybe that's a little bit like reaching to this form of this good, this ideal, let myself just be there. Yeah, I was enjoying the beauty of it, but there's something that moved me inside. And I can't probably put my finger completely on what that was. It was something that as I thought about it later, I was like, well, maybe it had to do with mortality. And again, some of these teachings that we're getting through Plato, this life is short. Live properly, live a just life. Take the moment as it is right now. And so I guess I totally agree with that, in that we need to approach Plato in that way at times as well.
Yeah, definitely. I think there's that aspect of just reading the Republic and just allowing its brilliance and its beauty to just come through, rather than trying to have a filter or projecting on what it should be. And that's the caution I think that I give to this thinking about this, and either listening to our podcast or listening to our podcast and reading Plato's Republic. I think another quote that I'd like to share is one by C.S. Lewis, and this is what C.S. Lewis said: "The first qualification for judging any piece of workmanship, from a corkscrew to a cathedral, is to know what it is, was intended to do, and how it is meant to be used." So we come to the Republic with what it is. What is it? What's a dialogue? It's a discussion. What is it intended to do? What is it meant to be used for? It's intended to give us a better perspective on how to lead a just life, how to lead a good life. In a sense, how to lead a happy life, and we'll define happy here in a second. What is it meant to be used for? It's meant to be used to not for academic purposes, not just for knowledge purposes. Okay, we know about this, but it's actually meant, and the people who were in the dialogue, they were looking for direction in their life to actually change their life based off of what Plato was saying in this. And let's go back to the idea of happiness. As you go through the dialogue, the idea of happiness is not what I think would be contemporary definition, this emotional high, if you will, but it's rather harmony and unity. It's harmony and unity within yourself. It's having the proper orientation within yourself of your intellect, your emotions, and your appetites or desires. It's having those in their proper place, and not allowing the appetites nor the emotions to be the rulers, but rather your intellect. So that's the harmony, that's the unity, and based off of what Plato is saying, that's happiness, is having harmony and unity between those elements of your soul.
Yeah, that totally resonates. And really, Plato uses a couple approaches through the Republic to help convey that message, help get us there. And you mentioned the first one, to some degree, Vince, is the dialogue, or this dialectic. It's one of the tools that Plato uses, and this is one of my big takeaways from going through this work, is that the power of the dialogue, the power of the discussion. Because you can ask yourself, how do I learn, how do I get to know something, some idea? Maybe you could ask even further than that, how do I really get to own that idea? And I'm not just regurgitating it from someone else. And how do I know that it's not only my idea, but then you can ask it, how is this the best idea within the realm of different ideas around that point? And I think if you go through this, well, I can use learning, I can study, I can find books, I can find material, I can learn. Okay, that's one way you can learn about something. You can also say, oh, I have experience. Let me rely upon my experience I've had. Okay, I can do that as well. I think that's all valuable. You can do that with other people too. Let me look at other people's experiences, other people's learning, and you bring that together. But I still think a key element in that, now you have all this information and knowledge. How do you sort through that and work it out? And I think the dialogue, the dialectic as Plato uses it, is a key part of that. So you have this discussion with someone else. Basically, now you're taking all those ideas and you're setting out there, and you're letting them be exposed. You're putting them out there so that someone else can also look at those ideas, challenge them, bring other ideas with it. And it's kind of this, I see this kind of this churning, this process as you're doing the dialogue, so that the goal of it is that you walk away, not just yourself, but the other party as well, with a better understanding altogether. And as you can ask, how do you figure things out? How do you work? And you can say this individually or within a society as well. I think the process is the same. You have to work through those ideas somehow, and the dialogue, whether it's two people only dialoguing or multiple people, I think it still functions very much the same. And it's one of my big takeaways as I stepped away from Plato's Republic now and looked at it and said, that's important for me to bring into my life. As I think I know something about a subject, do I really know it? Well, I don't know. I'm willing to dialogue about it. And to some degree, that's what we're doing here on the podcast, is we're putting our ideas out there and letting them be challenged as we go through these different works and these different people.
Yeah. But I think to add on to that, Jason, is that not only are you looking at multiple points of view, but let's say you have the opposing point of view, and this is what Plato did, is make that opposing point of view as strong as possible.
Yeah.
Not have a straw man. He made the opposing point of view as strong as possible in order for him to fully understand that, but also to make his argument even stronger still. And I think that's part of the dialectic, is saying, okay, I realize that we have differing views. Let me make your view even stronger, and let me see if my point of view can withstand the disagreement here.
Yeah, as you're talking through that, it reminds me of the difficulty of it. Because I think for you to really do that well, there's a certain level of humility you have to come to that table at. You have to come to the table here's my ideas. I'm presenting them as best I can. I'm also understanding your ideas and presenting them as best I can. With the whole, maybe one of the consequences of that is you walk away with some of your ideas changed. That's vulnerable. That feels threatening, especially if you're really holding on to certain ideas and saying, well, no, this baby's mine. This baby's mine. I know this one's true. This one's mine. And so that's difficult. And I guess the other aspect of that is I don't see that happening frequently in our society, especially around political stuff right now. To acknowledge that the other side even has a good point at all. You're almost a traitor to your own side if if you say something good about the other side,
Right.
let alone making their argument as strong as you can and having this kind of discourse, this dialogue. So I don't know what the answer to that is, but it seems like something needed for us to get to the best ideas, so those best ideas rise to the top, and that we live them out individually, I guess, and also throughout society.
Yeah, and to that end, this is what we're dancing a little bit around that, is that, let's just take the political side, is that neither side is correct. And this is what Plato is saying, is neither side is, I'm not completely correct, nor is my opposing arguments completely correct. But together, we can get closer to the truth. That's what we're going for. So back to your point, yeah, neither side is correct. But because neither side talks to each other or wants to talk to each other, will we ever get closer to what it should be? No, you can't. And I think that's the impetus to move towards that, is that I don't have all the right answers. You don't have all the right answers, but together we may get closer to the right answer. And that's what Plato points out, is that at the very beginning, and maybe he was being a little bit coy, I don't know anything. That's how he presented it. But at the same time, he made the other side of the argument very strong, and he moved towards, and I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt, he moved towards to an area or to a understanding that was better than what he had at the beginning. And so did everyone else in the dialogue.
Yeah.
And the next element we'll talk about is the city, building the city. And we'll just read through it, but I'll talk about it and then we'll read through it. Is that this idea, how to lead a good life? What is a just life? And Socrates basically presents it as, this is a difficult undertaking. I don't know if any of us can do this, but in order to do this best, let's take the idea of a city, because people are just in themselves, but just people make up a just city, correct? So we're going to see justice within a city. Can we not observe a city and see the elements within a city of justice and injustice and be able to observe it and understand it better in a city? And so this is basically Plato writing it through his protagonist, Socrates, and it's called this, he writes the idea of justice and injustice large. So Jason, why don't you start off your Socrates, and I'll be, I think, Adeimantus. Yeah, Adeimantus.
Okay. Here's Socrates. It says, the investigation we are undertaking is not an easy one, in my view, but requires keen eyesight. So since we are not clever people, I think we should adopt the method of investigation that we would use if, lacking keen eyesight, we were told to identify small letters from a distance, and then notice that the same letters existed somewhere else in a larger size and on a larger surface. We would consider it a godsend, I think, that we be allowed to identify the larger ones first, and then to examine the smaller ones to see whether they are really the same. And so let me go back and hit some of that. So
yeah, go ahead.
He's again, love how Plato, Socrates' character in this, he makes me laugh sometimes. I almost think that Plato has this kind of this dry sense of humor if I actually knew him. Maybe not. Maybe it's just the context of a different time period, but sometimes the way it comes out, it seems very humorous to me. But he's, Socrates come, oh, this is going to be a tough undertaking. We're not clever people. We're not going to be able to do this. But here's an idea. If we take something that has small letters and distance, let's see if we can't find something that's similar that has larger letters, and we could examine that first. Mm-hmm. So taking something more complex, here's a simple way to think of it. Taking something more complex, let's simplify it down and look at that, and then compare that and see if that makes sense, and then go back and compare it to the more complex or the more difficult thing to see. And that's really what he does between the individual and the city or the polis. And so this is his starting to make the argument why we need to set up the city and start discussing things around the city.
Yep. And Adamantis' response is, of course we would, meaning of course we would. It would be easier to see if it's bigger. So of course we would. But how is this case similar to our investigation of justice in your view?
I will tell you. We say, don't we, that there is a justice that belongs to a single man, and also one that belongs to a whole city?
Certainly.
And a city is larger than a single man?
Yes, it is larger.
Perhaps then there will be more justice in the larger thing, and it would be easier to discern. So if you are willing, let's first find out what sort of thing justice is in cities, and afterward look for it in the individual, to see if the larger entity is similar in form to the smaller one.
I think that is a fine idea.
If in our discussion we could look at a city coming to be, wouldn't we also see its justice coming to be, and its injustice as well?
We probably would.
And once that process is completed, could we expect to find what we are looking for more easily?
Yes, much more easily.
Do you think we should try to carry it out then? It is no small task in my view, so think it over.
It has been thought over. Don't do anything besides try. No, this is just great. This is just great because I think he has this, maybe even some sarcasm, is that he's just setting the dialogue up again. Maybe Plato's has a dry sense of humor, or just but he sets us up just such that this is where they're going anyways. He's going to set up the city in order for us to understand justice better. I think that's the main point. And the other point too is, Jason and I we want the audience to have some takeaway. So what is this takeaway? Is that when you have a very complex idea or a very complex problem that you're attempting to present to someone, think if you can put it into a story format that's easier to understand. Mm-hmm. So in this case, the idea of justice, very abstract idea in itself, but as Plato goes on, Socrates goes on, they put it in the form of a city. How does a city function? Well, nearly everyone can identify with how a city functions. What are the rulers? Does it need soldiers? Who are the citizenry? How do you get from one thing to the next? Do you have physicians? Do you have certain doctors? Do you have bankers? Okay, most people can identify with that. But can most people identify with the abstract idea of justice? A little bit more difficult task. So the take-home point here is this. If you have something difficult to present, put it in a story form that's easy to understand that makes those points.
Yeah. Well, I think you could also do it on the other side, too. If you're trying to understand something difficult, can you relate it to something more simple first?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And bring it to that level of understanding, knowing that, hey, I may not have the full thing figured out or pictured quite right yet, but I've simplified it. Now I can get some grasp of what it is. Mm-hmm. And again, story form is a powerful way to do that.
No, that's good. That's good. So let's mention a couple things here as far as in Plato's Republic, the first book presents two and then alludes to three different ways of living the good life. So the first way is what I've basically defined as the conventional life. And the conventional life is one that you would find in business and probably on a very surface level. So business, your word is your bond. You're honorable. When you complete a transaction, everyone's aware of what the transaction is. You complete it as said. The conventional life also is one that you're true to yourself, you're true to your words, and you're true to your friends. So you do your best that you can for your business. You do your best you can for your family and friends. So you're honorable, you're respectable. But there's an incompleteness there. Not that Plato mentions it right at the beginning, but later on, and there's an incompleteness there. So that's the conventional life. Is there anything wrong with the conventional life? No, it's just incomplete. It's just not well. There's not very little depth to it. I'll say that. There's an incompleteness. There's not a depth to it. And that's pretty much presented by Polemarchus and Cephalus. So those are the two individuals that present that right in book 1. There's this unconventional life that's presented by Thrasymachus, who's a philosopher. And his point is that to lead a life of a tyrant, you make the rules. You live, there's no morality. There's no, as Jason and I are alluding to, there's no hierarchy of ideas. There's no courage versus cowardness. It doesn't matter. What is the ruler within an unconventional life? One of immorality, the tyrant is a lust. And that lust is a desire for whatever you have. It's a lust, a desire to fulfill all the desires. At the very bottom of everything, there's this desire to fill all the desires. So the desire to have money, the desire to have food, the desire for drink, the desire for sex. That's the base desire. That's what Thrasymachus is basically saying. You fulfill that, and in a sense, it's a life that consumes and is consumed. And that's what we find out later. It's a life that consumes and is consumed. It corrupts and destroys, back to the definition of good and bad. It's a bad life because all it does is it corrupts and destroys. It corrupts the soul, destroys the body. The argument for the unjust life, there was a story about Gyges, which is the invisible man, and he had a ring that made him invisible. And he carried out, because he had the invisible ring, he killed the king and became the king. He became the tyrant. That's the unconventional. And that's basically, that is the argument opposing Socrates' argument and Plato's argument of the good life. And what's the good life for them is that it's a life that moves towards the ideal. And an idea, in Greek it was called the nous, the idea, the form of the good. It's that. It's moving towards it. It's a hierarchical system. It's a life governed and oriented in an appropriate hierarchy. The best at the top, meaning the intellect at the top. Right below the intellect is the spirit or the emotions in the middle, and right on the bottom is the desires and the passions at the bottom, the appetites at the bottom. In the city, that becomes the philosopher king as the leader of the city. The warriors or the soldiers are protecting the city, that's the emotions, and then the citizenry is the appetites, the very bottom. So you can see kind of at least a little bit of how he compares the two. Yeah. And for its own sake, there's this health, there's this life of oriented in that fashion that leads to wisdom and to a complete life. And one of the components of that is the idea of division of labor, and that's more probably a more modern term. He didn't use division of labor, but he says, do what you're most suited to do, meaning the intellect should do what it's most suited to do. The soldiers, the warriors should do what they're most suited to do, and the citizenry should do what you're most suited to do. But it also means that the individual themselves do what they're most suited to do. So if the individual is suited to, and this is the individual as a whole, is suited to be a doctor, then that should be a doctor. Whether it's male or female, it doesn't matter. If they're suited to be a ruler, they should be the ruler. If they're suited to be a craftsman, they should be a craftsman. And so this idea that, in a practical point that I think you get out of Plato at this point, is you should do what you're suited to do. Did you have a comment on that, Jason?
Yeah, just this is, I guess, one of my big takeaways from the Republic itself is this. I guess first you talked about the hierarchy, and again he uses the polis to bring it back to the individual, but that, I guess, a greater realization that there is a hierarchy within ourselves, and that a proper orientation of that hierarchy is important. And like you said, the intellect on top, that's the one that should be making the decision, the leader making that. And then you also have the passions or the emotions that should come in line and help support that leader. And then the base desires. And even though there's a hierarchy, they're still all important. They all play an important role within yourself. And there's kind of sometimes I hesitate to use the word balance, because balance sometimes means equals on one side versus the other. It's more of an equilibrium where there's a harmony within those. that the ruler is doing the ruling part, the emotions are doing the emotion part, and the base desires are playing their part. And so that's just something I've taken away from Plato, and thinking about that in my own life and saying, how am I doing on that? Have I thought through that? Am I, or you can even think in a moment or a situation, say, how did I approach that problem or situation? Was it all emotional based? Was I all fired up and blew my top? Oh, then I kind of lost that hierarchy. I let things get turned over, where the soldier, the emotion, he took over for a while, didn't he? It's like, yeah, he did. Or the base desires, perhaps. Well, I just snacked down on a whole bowl of popcorn and had some candy bars, and wait a minute here, was that a good decision? So to me there's that harmony, there's that equilibrium, if you will, and we need to examine that and look at that.
Yeah. No, I think you hit it right. Is that I think oftentimes when you say this balance, you're thinking of this equality, and at least I'll go a little bit here in physiology. There's nothing that's static. There's nothing that has balance in it. The only thing that when things are balanced or static was when you're dead. But otherwise, there's all this fluctuation. There's trying this reorientation to get back to what it should be. So it's always these gives and takes. I mean, in order for you to function, there's always. In order for us to move, we have to use energy. Well, once we use energy, then more energy has to be built up. Well, how do we get more energy? Well, we have to eat. So it's not okay, we eat this much and then we put out this much energy and then things stop. No, it's always this constant give and take. And trying to find an equilibrium is probably as close as you're going to get to it.
They actually call it I think my phrase I like to use is a dynamic equilibrium.
That's a good one.
It's in a moment it might be there's an equilibrium, but that equilibrium is probably going to change. And I get this from my chemistry background. As conditions change, you change temperature, change pressure. Well, it's going to want to go to a new equilibrium. So it by calling it dynamic equilibrium, there throws in there that it has a likelihood of changing over time.
No, I like that. I like that a lot. Yeah, that's exactly what it is. And we'll go back a little bit. Is that this idea of division of labor? And this is Socrates, a quote from Socrates. It says, "Each of us is naturally not quite like anyone else, but rather differs in his nature. Different men are apt for the accomplishment of different jobs." So again, that's the idea that not all of us can do one thing. We all have different natures. We're not quite exactly like anyone else. Our natures are a little bit different, and each man is a little bit different such that they can do different jobs. And to relate this, we stopped there with division of labor, and I think one other thing I wanted to address with regard to the orientation is that the intellect at the top is few in number, few in force, if you will. It doesn't have a lot of power, as demonstrated just by, let's just say not a lot of power. Our emotions oftentimes get the best of us because it's a little bit more powerful. Our desires, our appetites oftentimes get the best of us more times than not. So in a sense, Plato is saying, by any means necessary, establish that harmony, establish that orientation. Even if you have to be, in some way, not deceitful to yourself, that's probably not right, but just by any means necessary. Get that proper orientation. Work as hard as you can in order to accomplish that, because your desires aren't going to just roll over and go away very easily. Either are your emotions. So it's a lot of work and a lot of concentration in order for that to happen. The intellect, despite its beauty and its force in itself, and that's the best part of us. It's so little in its sense of power that it's easily overwhelmed by the other ones.
Yeah, that's true. Especially when you get towards the end of the Republic, the case that he makes for a just life the evidence becomes overwhelming. Like, oh, gee, why would anybody choose anything different? Just life is where it's all at. And yeah. I'll read this quote here, and it kind of lays out maybe some of the challenge of that. And it says, "Vice in abundance is easy to choose. The road is smooth. and it lies very near, while the gods have set sweat before virtue, and it is the long road, rough and steep.
Mm.
And it speaks to the challenge of keeping that proper orientation, keeping towards the virtue, not the vice, because it does take work. Where the vice very very often comes from not caring about the work, just letting things go, tends to lead towards the vice. And this one thought that reminded me of thinking about this is this. In some ways, it can get easier, and that comes in this form of habit. As I was thinking through this and saying, if we can start building good habits toward the virtue, then it's not always this continual fight between the intellect and the passions and the emotions and the base desires, but we start getting set up for certain patterns. So maybe that's one thing down the road we'll talk about, Vincent, and how do we build habits, because that seems like that would be a tool to help us stay towards the virtue and not the vice.
Right. No, I agree. Did you want to touch on the education too? That kind of falls right in line with this.
Yeah, I think I will. And actually, I was thinking about this earlier. I don't know if you ever heard that phrase that says, hire a teenager while he still knows everything.
No, I've heard of that.
You ever heard of that? There's several quotes and stuff like that where, basically this concept where the teenager, he knows everything, so hire him before he, grows out of teen or his young adulthood and stops knowing everything. Well, I was thinking about that. I say, well, why is that? Why is that in those teen years that we come to this place where we either think of ourselves as knowing everything, or we project this feeling like we know everything? And I was like, okay, here's probably what it is. So, we grow up, we start gaining some knowledge and experience. And I think in those teenage years is probably at the point when we've finally gotten enough experience and knowledge, and then we can combine that with assumptions and making connections between all this data and information we've had, and you can kind of sort out life to a decent degree, where you can be somewhat competent in life and say, okay, I understand kind of what life is about. It's very simplistic, right? It's kind of like our model we've talking about, where it's a very simple model. It probably doesn't reflect reality, but it's kind of a model that's put together finally. And so we have this sense like we know everything. I've got it figured out. I know what life's about. I've experienced enough. Well, you live a little bit more, and you say, "Whoa, that model was really simple." Life is actually it's more complex than that, right. And so this is where education comes in my mind, and learning, and Plato really brought that out in my mind again. Is that education might be the only lever we have to keep growing out and keep learning, and also I guess along with that, maybe some of the challenge in becoming an adult and maybe throughout your adulthood is that you should be going back to some of those assumptions you made in your teens and your early adulthood and challenging them and looking at them again and saying, I always believe this. Why did I believe that? How did I believe that? And educating yourself through that. So that's really something that came out through Plato. I said that it seems like the only tool, because if you think about it, what do we have? You have your biology. A lot of that is kind of there. You're given that. I mean, you have some control over it. You can take care of your health better and have some impacts on your biology. You have your environment. Again, a lot of that we were given what we were given, depending where you're born. You have some control maybe later on in life. You can kind of change your environment and have that influence on you. But it seems like the real lever you have to move your life in whatever direction you decide you want to move it is education. Is that information and knowledge and experience that you can bring in and therefore use that, become something different, and move your life in a direction that you want it to go. Yeah. And I see throughout the whole Republic, Plato really being very, very cautious on education. And that's where he kind of gets into these censorship things. And I think it really comes from this place of, man, we got to be careful what we take in. Because what you take in becomes you, and that's all you have.
No, I think that's exactly it. It's pretty much the only big lever that we have. You mentioned, okay, you got your biology, what you are, really can't change that. Your environment, the household you grew up in, your father, mother, your family around you, whether you had those or not, you really couldn't change all that much until you got older. So as you become an adult or late teen, the only thing you have is education. And I think we should make this clear, Jason, we're not talking about formal education necessarily. It can be that, yeah, but it doesn't have to be. It doesn't have to be. It can be self-education.
I'll
And
say,
this is where,
especially now with the technology we have, man,
yeah,
there's so much how self-education you could do compared to, even in our youth, Vince, even 30 years ago was very different. And 100 years ago, vastly
yeah,
different. So,
right. No, exactly that. And right to your point, Jason, is that because education is one of the only levers, if not, I would say the biggest lever that we have to be very careful, or we should be very selective on what we educate ourselves to be. And Plato was very adamant about this. In a sense, he was advocating for censorship. Here, I'll read a couple quotes about censorship. He says, quote, "So our first task, it seems, is to supervise the storytellers. If they make up a good story, we must accept it. If not, we must reject it." And why is that? Is that he's talking about, in this point, built the Guardians. We should have talked a little bit about the Guardians, but that is going to be the ruling class, and that's going to be the soldiers. So the stories they initially hear are the ones that start to form them, and that's why you have to be very careful about what you're letting in. You think about in a large degree, the story that you tell yourself is what you become. Even if it's a wrong story, it's like Jason was saying, well, look at the stuff you told yourself, the things you believe. Maybe you've been saying those things for decades now, and they're untrue. Why then? Because why are they untrue? In that you've never analyzed them, or we've never analyzed them to really see, well, what's the story behind that? Well, why do I believe that? But those stories we tell is who we become. So it's, again, really important when we start educating ourselves that we're very selective on what we read and what we take in and the stories that we hear. Here's another one by Socrates that says, "We will persuade nurses and mothers to tell the acceptable ones to their children, and to spend far more time shaping their souls with these stories than they do shaping their bodies by handling them. Many of the stories they tell now, however, must be thrown out." So again, as a child, if you have children, or you think about stories and you think it's a fascinating, and Jason and I think have done this, is think about the stories that you grew up with and how impactful those are today. Not even, someone may have made a slight comment, but for whatever reason, they really stuck and they really put you on the trajectory of where you are now. But examine those stories and see if they're true. But Plato's point to this is that as we self-educate ourselves, as we incorporate education as part of leading a good life, be very selective on what you ingest.
yeah, no, that seemed very important. I know this is one of those areas where you talked about, Vince, where people get off on the tangents of some of Plato, and talk about, well, he advocates for censorship. And I mean, if you look at some of his readings, it looks that way, that he's talking about the city and there should be censorship. But again, if you take it back to the individual and ask that question, what is the big picture and what is his focus through this? It's really the importance of what we take in and on the individual level. So that's important.
Yeah. So let's go. We'll start talking about the just life or the good life in a little bit more detail. The thing to keep in mind with the just life is it's the whole individual. It's the body and soul, all the parts of the soul. That's what Plato is looking at. He's not looking at, can I make the appetites happy? Can I make the intellect happy? Can I make the emotions happy? No. Or can I fulfill any one of those three by themselves? Can I make the body happy? No. It's, can I make the whole individual happy? Some of those parts are probably not going to be, there's no equality there in a sense. There's not going to be an equal amount of input for each one of those. And so there's that aspect, I think, to keep in mind. As we've been mentioning too, part of the just life is being very selective on who your heroes and gods are. The name of the podcast, 73 Mentors, is because we're very selective on those individuals we present. Why is that? Because when we pick out our heroes, when we pick out our god or gods, that's who we're trying to become. They interview athletes all the time and they ask them, who's your hero? Oh, it's such and such athlete that was, played for such and such individual, and I try to pattern my game after him or her. Well, again, you're patterning your whole life after someone else because you want to be like that other person. Same thing with our heroes and gods. We want to be like those people. So be very careful with that. The other aspect of leading the good life is there's two elements. I'll talk about the first one is the element of courage. So this is Socrates, or I'm sorry, this is a couple quotes. This is a quote by Tacitus, a Roman Empire historian and senator. He says, "The desire for safety stands against every great and noble enterprise." Again, I'll read that again. "The desire for safety stands against every great and noble enterprise." And this is when Plato was talking about courage, he's saying you have to be courageous. Part of leading the good life, part of being a life of harmony and unity, of one of happiness, is being courageous. You have to move into areas that are frightening, but still that you have the courage to move into those. Here's another quote. I think most people recognize. This is by FDR. I'll read the whole thing. Most people know the first part, but the second part I think is as important, if not more important. This is FDR says, "Let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror, which paralyzes needed efforts to convert retreat into advance." So most of us have heard the only thing to fear is fear itself. Well, what is fear? FDR went on to name it's a nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror. And what does this nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror do to us? It paralyzes us. And when does it paralyze us? It paralyzes us at the very moment that we need to convert retreat to advance. Again, the whole idea is that we need to be courageous. And if we have fear, the fear in itself is that emotion that prevents us to go forward, go backwards rather than forward when we really need to go forward. And oftentimes our fears are nameless. We really can't put a name to it, or they're unreasoning, or they're really just unjustified terrors. So that's an idea of courage. And Jason, you were going to talk about another element of the just life.
The next one he hits is temperance. Now this is one of those words that we don't hear that much in our time, but it's moderation. I think of harmony when I hear about temperance, moderation and harmony. But I'll read this quote from Socrates. It says this: "And aren't the most important aspects of temperance for the majority of people, at any rate, to obey the rulers and to rule over the pleasures of drink, sex, and food for themselves?" Yeah, this just takes me back to the idea and the concept of that equilibrium, that harmony within the hierarchy between that in yourself, and that you need to keep that moderation, so we don't go in excess in any ways. And I think we talked about earlier in one of our episodes how even excess in good things leads to bad. Because we're a creature of multi needs and multi parts, and so all those parts have to be work together.
I'll hit on another quote, Jason, and this is kind of getting to where we're going as far as talking about the different divisions of the soul. It says, quote, "Twisted thinking is the forerunner and companion of tyranny." Again, twisted thinking is the forerunner and companion of tyranny. The whole idea is the intellect gets twisted. It doesn't know which way to go. And that's just a prelude to a tyrannical life.
No, that's a good, because that reminds me of Vince, is that we talked about the tyrant. We talked about sometimes the tyrant comes because of being led by the passions or being led by the base desires, and that could lead to the tyrant. But I think this quote is also another way. It's because of bad thinking. So the intellect gone bad is another way that the tyrant comes in yourself or comes within a society. So there's many levels we have to guard against in ourselves. And even if you have the right orientation, now you got to say, "Oh, now my idea is good." So then we go back again into the dialogue, into getting information, into getting data and sorting that through to help keep those things in line.
Yeah. And we'll talk briefly about the idea of we've alluded to it multiple times, but there's this soul, the division of the soul. The intellect is at the top, the spirit is right below that, and the desires are below that. The intellect corresponds in the city to the philosopher king or the ruler, and that's a lover of truth. The spirit is the warriors or the soldiers in the city, and they correspond to courage. Desires in the individual and the soul correspond to the workers, and those basically represent the appetites. And I think that's just important to keep in mind when we start talking about the five constitutions of individuals. And we alluded to also this idea of a higher good, this ideal good. And Plato uses two analogies and one allegory. So the two analogies, one is the analogy of the sun, the other one's the analogy of the line, and then probably the most famous component of all of Plato's Republic, and I even read it a long time ago when I was in philosophy class in school, in college, is that the allegory of the cave. And that's in book 7, and that's probably his most famous component of the whole thing. But the purpose of all the two analogies and the allegory is to introduce and associate or to understand the idea of the form of the good, which is the ideal state. And that's the ultimate form. That's what gives light and understanding to the intellect. When we was talking about the allegory of the cave, is that the cave is the ignorance, you're in a dark place, you rise out of that cave, you see some things around you, you don't really see the sun yet. The sun itself is the ultimate form, or the form of the good, which gives light upon everything on the earth and all the images. And that's where we're moving to. And the intellect, in a sense, is only on that surface and doesn't quite ever look up, or very few of us quite look up to the sun directly. We're always just seeing reflections. So that's the form of the good. Is I think the easiest way to think about that is it's the ideal.
The ideal, yeah. Something higher, and we feel. I like how that, like the concept of brushing up against it. Mm-hmm. I think throughout our lives we feel that we have this concepts of ideal. I mean, probably all of us out there can think of. Can you imagine a better version of yourself? Mm. Yeah, I can. Or you could ask yourself, am I living up to my fullest potential? I'm like, well, no. I mean, there's some place I can improve. I mean, I can feel that in myself, as I think probably we all can. So what is that? What am I reaching towards? And I think that's that ideal, the form of the good that Plato's talking about. There's something else out there. There's a more perfect, more pure, more true thing out there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this otherness, and I think in today's contemporary we'd say this otherness, or maybe even some transcendency, this element of beyond. Yeah, you're right. We're attempting to move towards that, and he's advocating for that. So you want to take the five constitutions? We just go back and forth on those?
Yeah, we'll hit them. Plato presents 5 constitutions, and I'll name them, then we'll go back and talk about them.
Okay, that's fine.
Starts with aristocracy, and timocracy, oligarchy, democracy, and tyranny. And he really lays that down in his argument, his order, where the aristocracy, that's the proper order. That's the philosopher king as the ruler. And that's where the people love the truth. They have the right hierarchy. You have below that philosopher king, you have the guardians taking care of the city. And below that, you have the citizenry all playing their proper roles. So there's life, there's harmony, there's unity within the city. I think it's another element of that. They have the shared story. He gets in book 5. He gets kind of into that, and that's where he gets into some other ideas too that people have commented a lot about. But that unity and that shared story, I think, is part of that, where they all play their proper roles. And then you get to democracy, which is kind of a level from that. In his time, I think Sparta was in a more of a democracy, where it still has a lot of good, but now it's moved a little bit where they're lovers of honor, and often in this one you have the military. The great warrior is the honored one. So this is kind of also, and again, Plato does this throughout his whole Republic, where he's he's talking about the justice to the individual, but he's multi-layering it. Now he has the polis he's talking about. Now he's talking about these constitutions, both in the city, but also within the individual. So he's hitting multi-layers. So this democracy often relates to where the passion or the emotions are the ruler. Mm-hmm. So, and then a little further, degradation, if you will, in the way that Plato laid it out, you get to oligarchy. And now, basically, you're to the desire level. The lovers of desires are money or your appetite. And that really is what rules, is the desires. And then many of us would be surprised to find even lower than that is democracy. And I've argued with Plato about this too. And basically democracy, what happens there, and the way Plato laid it out, now you don't have a clear hierarchy. You're bouncing from who's ruling. Well, today the intellect's ruling. Well, tomorrow the desires, the base desires are ruling. Oh, the next day it's the passions. So it's basically no hierarchy. It changes all the time. There's a lot of disorder when the way he lays that out, and it's ruled by this concept we value pretty highly, and it's the value of freedom. Mm-hmm. We want to be really free to choose and to have this. Don't put any constraints on me. Yeah, I guess this was an interesting part for me too in the Republic, is to reflect upon democracy and on freedom and the way that Plato talks about it, and I still think I really like it in terms that it's a lot of it's choosing for ourselves. Through freedom, we get to choose these things for ourselves. It's like this concept where he says you need to be in the right place. All of us, if you want to talk about the society side, but choosing the thing that you're best suited for. Well, I like the concept of, well, I'm the one that's best to make that decision for myself. That seems to play, and that plays in with democracy, I think, and freedom. But Plato did cause me to reflect upon it and think about some of the downsides of it, especially within yourself, within that hierarchy. And then the last one is, as you mentioned earlier, Vince, this lover of lust, ruled by lust more than anything else, and that's the tyranny, or the tyrant, and that's really the most wretched life. And Plato did a great job of really laying that out, because my first thought was, well, if you're the tyranny, you get everything you want. That's maybe it's hell for everybody else, but the tyrant's the one that he's going to be living it up. Really, Plato laid it out and said, no, actually, the tyrant is the most miserable of all. And this is the point where we also get to, it's like, oh, this is so obvious. Just choose the just life. This is the best life.
Right. No, I mean, a couple comments on that is that this idea of, Jason, I talked about a little bit, is that we are hierarchical. Even I think to contemporary society would say that's even a bad word. You can't mention hierarchical systems. And hierarchical systems are essentially evil. And I think Plato lays it out, and I think it lays it out fairly succinctly, and I think it's true, is that we are hierarchical beings. Something's going to rule us. Something's within us is going to rule us. So one of these three parts is going to rule us. Either our intellect's going to rule us, our emotions are going to rule us, or the appetite's going to rule us. Now, if you approach this rationally, you would have the intellect rule us. But if you don't, as a democratic man, you could pick any one of those and say, today or right now, I'm going to have my appetites rule me. I'm looking for money. Fine. Tomorrow, I'm really upset. I'm really angry. My anger is going to rule me. And then the next day, well, I'm going to be a philosopher. You can have the philosopher rule you. So there's this chaos. But my point is that we are in a hierarchical system, whether you want to believe it or not. We are, and it's just a matter, and that's how Plato lays out. It's a matter of what kind of hierarchical system are you going to choose? Are you going to choose to allow your passions to rule you, to allow your emotions to rule you, or are you going to allow your intellect to rule you, or are you going to allow whatever happens to be that day? That's what you're going to allow to rule you, or are you going to go even a step below that and just be lustful? Just go after it and fulfill all those appetites. And the reason that the tyrant is so miserable is it's insatiable. He can't even rule himself because he can't fulfill all his desires. And he makes all those around him even more miserable because he's trying to get it from them. So that's even the worst situation. And his life is just wretched. So the point is that any one of those outside of the aristocratic man, it's incomplete. You're losing something there. It's not the good life. It's not the life that right from the beginning. What is a just life? A just life, by definition, per Plato, is that you do what you're suited to do. You do what you're made to do. In that regard, is the intellect does what it's made to do, the emotions are made to do, and the desires what are made to do, and your whole being, our whole beings are made to do what they're supposed to do. That is a just life. Anything outside of that, you lose some part. It becomes incomplete, or even sometimes wretched.
Yeah, yeah, and yeah, I don't have much more to say. Wrapping things up here, talking about Plato. I guess it really surprised me, and I know I've said this several times, but still, I think it's worth saying one more time. And that how much Plato had to say 2,400 years ago to what's going on right now in our day. So that speaks to me. It speaks to the commonality in this human experience we have on the one level, and saying, yeah, we're still human. He was human back then, and we're still going through very much the same struggle. And maybe it also speaks to the challenge of the human experience, and the fact that we seem to struggle with the same things that they were struggling with back then. Even with all our advances in technology and knowledge that we seem to have gained, the basic human struggle is very much the same. And I guess I'm also encouraged that there are things that we can do to improve upon our current situation, no matter where it's at. And you know, in the other podcast, Vincent Story Hinge, I talk to people about stories often and hear about their own story. And like we mentioned somewhat here tonight, again, it's just looking at your own story, and even the parts that have already happened to you, there's some growth to happen, to gain through those times, and to start crafting a better story for yourself. And I think Plato does a great job in giving us some tools and some vantage points to look at that, to look at our own story and start taking steps towards improvement, if that's what we want. So that's kind of my closing thoughts, and excited to carry on with those things that Plato shared with us.
Yeah, I have a couple closing thoughts, and I'll have a story. So I came away. Three things really struck me. I think several things. If I was to break it down this way, is that his definition of good and evil. Good is that it's preserving and beneficial. It's bad if it's corrupting and destroying. Was fascinating. I think that definition of good and evil is wonderful. How you determine if you have a soul, and the three parts of the soul, I think was very fascinating. And that's where we get the soul of the soul being made up of the intellect, of the emotions, and of the desires, the appetites. I think that part was fascinating. And then thirdly is when he started describing the immortality of the soul. I thought that was equally as fascinating as finding the soul. And in book 10, right at the end of book 10, there's the myth of and the reason he mentions the myth of is that this life of virtue that he's advocating for, this just life that Plato's advocating for and making an argument for, does not only have benefits in this life, but based off the myth of it has benefits in the life after. So there's this continuation of benefit. There's a continuation of honors. There's a continuation of the intellect. And so all that to say is that the book was wonderful. And I think once you get all the way through it and then you start reading it again, it just gets more refined, and you get to see more and more elements. And this time, I think I've read it through, I think 4 or 5 times now. So every time I read it, it's like, okay, I pick up something different. It's that depth that you get from it. And I'll end with this story. So the same trip that we went to the Barnes Foundation to see these wonderful paintings, I was also spent an entire day at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. And the Philadelphia Museum of Art is fantastic. It's just wonderful. Right outside the Philadelphia Museum of Art is the statue of Rocky. So this was the statue that was, if you know anything about the Rocky movies, the boxer, he runs up the steps and then he raises his hand in triumph. Well, the steps that he's running up is at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. So as I was there for the day, going back and forth and watching people, and I shared with Jason is that at any one time there was at minimum 10 people running up the stairs pretending they were Rocky and raising their hands. And at one point, watching these people, I was thinking that's kind of crazy, but I mean that's fine because, that's what people do. Even tourists were doing this. It was just fascinating to me. So as I was watching these people, it was fascinating. But the other thing that was fascinating is that they erected a sculpture of Rocky, not at the top of the steps, but over to the side of the Museum of Art, the Philadelphia Museum of Art. And I was there a couple of times watching this statue. It was off to the side. And at any one time, there was at least 20 people, and oftentimes there was 30 or more people in line to step in front of the statue and take a picture. And I was just saying how interesting and fascinating this is that these people are standing with this fictional character. And I'll make 2 points of this, is that within 100 yards, you're at the entrance of one of the best art museums in all the world with some of the masterpieces of masterpieces. And yet you're spending your time in line taking a picture by a fictional character. Just the dichotomy there was just fascinating. I think the other thing, and probably even probably more fascinating, is that there's a Rodin sculpture museum. You can see it from the Rocky statue. Now, Rodin sculpted the Thinking Man, and he also sculpted the Kiss and many others, but those are his 2 famous ones. And the Thinking Man, we spent time there too, is that there's something visceral that happens to you, I think, when you just look at it and you realize someone did this, the Thinking Man. And then I think even more so, equal so, is when you look at the Kiss. There's something there's some admiration, there's some element of that beauty that is transmitted when you see that sculpture. And there's just something real about it. And I'm just thinking the dichotomy that exists. And no one was standing, there was a couple people, there were a couple people standing in line to take pictures by the Thinking Man. But by the Kiss, there was maybe 1 or 2 people milling around. They were not even, maybe even paying attention sometimes. And I'm just thinking, what kind of people are we that we stand in line for a long time to take a picture by a Rocky statue, a fictional character that really has, even the sculpture isn't even that good, to do that, and you can walk 10 minutes and be by Rodin, Thinking Man, and the Kiss and other sculptures that he makes. They're just wonderful. They ooze and they're imbued with beauty. And I leave with that story and end with that story because in many respects, Plato's Republic is like the Rodin sculpture. It's imbued with beauty. There's a brilliance there that's fascinating. It's absolutely fascinating. And same thing with the Rodin statues is they'll change the trajectory of your life a little bit. I'd say with Plato's Republic, it's done more trajectory change, but still can. Spend time in there, and I encourage you to spend time there rather than spend time with the Rocky. I mean, this doesn't have the trajectory change that you would have than something as brilliant and as beautiful as the Plato's Republic, and that's where I am. Thanks for joining us. Next time, join us. We're going to be going through Galileo, and Galileo is equally as fascinating of Plato as Plato. And Jason and I have started reading up on that and getting ready for that. So please join us as we get into Galileo, his works. And if you don't know about his works, of nothing else, he was an astronomer that changed the trajectory of Western civilization with regard to, he showed that the Earth actually rotated around the sun and not the other way around as was thought before. And there's a fairly good conflict that happens between him and the church that goes on for many, many decades and centuries before it actually is changed over. But he's an equally brilliant presenter of ideas as Plato. All right. Thank you for joining us.